The Zogcal research station hummed with the quiet buzz of activity as it orbited a gas giant far from the heart of galactic civilization. It was a place of peace, a hub for advanced scientific endeavors where races from across the stars came to exchange knowledge. Yet today, the air on the station was thick with anticipation, because today something new and unsettling was about to unfold. A transport shuttle had just docked, bringing with it a delegation of humans, Deathworlders, as they were known in the galaxy. These creatures hailed from a planet so hostile to life that nearly every step they took was fraught with danger. Their home was a place of violent storms, ferocious predators, and diseases that could wipe out entire populations. They had survived and thrived in an environment that would destroy most other life forms within hours. Dr. Vigric, a member of the Karathi species, stood in the observation bay, watching as the humans filed out of the shuttle. The Karathi were known for their sharp intellects, their tall, segmented bodies, and their highly ordered societies. In comparison to the human species, they were a model of perfection, at least they thought so. But the humans, who were small, seemingly fragile, and chaotic in their movements, disturbed him. They were alive in a way that made him uneasy, as though they were the ultimate survivors, constantly defying the odds that should have wiped them out centuries ago. Beside him stood a Tefax, tall, lean, and cloaked in a flowing black robe that made them appear like an almost otherworldly shadow. Their race had long ago mastered the art of self-control, meditation, and precision. They valued logic and reason above all else. They spoke only in measured, deliberate tones, and the mere thought of chaos was anathema to them. And yet they were here, just as curious, just as apprehensive as the Karathi, watching these humans with an intensity that could rival the darkest corners of their homeworld. "Do you think they will survive this?" Dr. Vigric asked, unable to keep the edge of concern from his voice. The Tefax's black eyes flicked toward the humans. "Survive? It is not survival that worries me. It is what lies within them, the capacity to endure. I have never seen such a drive in any species, not even our own." The human recruits, no more than 30 in total, were standing in front of a towering, burly figure dressed in dark green fatigues, a human instructor, by all appearances, though his weathered face suggested a life spent in countless conflicts. His presence seemed to dwarf the recruits, who were small in comparison, their clothes ill-fitting, their faces showing a mixture of uncertainty and determination. The instructor spoke, his voice sharp and commanding, and the humans snapped to attention, ready for whatever came next. The Karathi scientist couldn't help but shake his head in disbelief. He had read about human warfare and their brutal, unyielding training methods, but to see at firsthand this display of raw willpower and fearlessness was something entirely different. "What kind of creatures are they?" he muttered to no one in particular. "Their bodies, their minds, they are not like us." The Tefax answered with their usual calm. "They are the product of a world that has pushed them to the brink of destruction, and yet they continue to rise. If anything, their resilience is impressive." The humans began to move, their eyes focused on their instructor, their bodies tense and ready. They were about to face an obstacle course that would test their endurance, their strength, and most of all, their will to survive. The aliens, each with their own highly evolved senses and natural abilities, could hardly imagine the physical and mental toll it would take on the humans, but they would soon see. And as the humans began their training, pushing their bodies beyond the point of exhaustion, forcing themselves through grueling physical challenges, the alien delegates could only watch in stunned silence. Every step these humans took was a reminder of the savage beauty of their species, an unyielding force that had survived against all odds, and one that seemed to be powered by something deeper, something almost primal. The Deathworlders were here, and they were ready to show the galaxy what they were made of. The humans stood in a haphazard line before their instructor, Sergeant Major Adams, each one trying to suppress the visible signs of anxiety that threatened to break through. The aliens, clustered behind observation screens and holographic projectors, observed them with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. These creatures, small, fragile by most galactic standards, had earned the title of Deathworlders from the galaxy's various species, but the alien delegates could not fathom what that truly meant. To them, a Deathworlder was simply a species that had managed to survive on a planet far too hostile to sustain intelligent life. But what they had heard in theory, they were about to witness firsthand. Sergeant Major Adams stepped forward, his boots heavy on the metal floor of the training facility. His voice was low, but the weight of it sent a ripple of tension through the air. "Welcome to your first lesson in becoming a soldier. Forget everything you think you know. You are not just here to fight, you are here to survive. On Earth, if you want to live, you need to adapt, or you die. Here you'll learn what that means." His voice hardened as he continued, "I will push you to the edge of your limits. The only thing I need from you is that you don't quit." Dr. Vigric, the Karathi scientist, found himself watching the humans intently. Their posture, while nervous, held something that made his antennas flicker with unease. A strange energy radiated from them, something that seemed to say they were ready, even if they weren't prepared. What is this force within them, he wondered. The human recruits weren't staring at Adams with fear, but with a kind of resolve, an unwillingness to give in to the very concept of failure. It was something alien to most other species, who would have long ago accepted the inevitability of limits. Adams gestured toward the obstacle course, a sprawling, brutal series of physical challenges that would test every ounce of the human's endurance. The course was designed to break them, to push them beyond the point of exhaustion and into the raw instinct to survive. It was not a mere test of strength, it was a trial of willpower, and as the humans began to march toward the first obstacle, the alien delegation leaned forward in their seats, eager to witness the carnage. "You've got an hour. Make it count," Adams barked, and the recruits scattered toward the first obstacle, a 15-meter wall that stretched impossibly high. The aliens watched as the humans approached it, their bodies heavy with doubt. But then, one of them, a young woman, her face set in fierce determination, leaped forward, grabbing the wall with both hands. Her feet slid against the surface, but she didn't stop. With an almost unnatural grace, she used her legs to push off, reaching higher, struggling, and finally hauling herself up. The others followed, some failing, others pushing themselves to the limit to clear the obstacle. Those who couldn't make it were quickly pushed aside by Adams, who showed no mercy. The humans, already sweating and breathless, moved on to the next part, a narrow crawl space that led them through a tunnel flooded with knee-deep, viscous mud. The alien delegates watched in disbelief as the humans slithered through the muck, caked in grime, and yet determined to finish the task. "What are they doing?" murmured one of the Izal, a species known for their extreme biological adaptations, their ability to shift between phases of matter. "This is madness. Their physiology isn't built for this kind of physical exertion." The Tefax answered with an expression that barely hinted at concern. "Their bodies may not be built for this, but their minds are. The mind is what drives them, not their muscles." Indeed, as the humans advanced, each challenge became more brutal, more demanding. They had to climb walls slick with grease, leap over fiery pits, and drag weighted sleds through sandstorms of artificial debris. The strain was evident. Many of the recruits were gasping for breath, their muscles trembling. But they did not stop. They staggered, crawled, and pushed themselves forward with an intensity that left the alien observers speechless. At one point, a human male stumbled, his face contorted in pain as he reached for a ledge that seemed just out of reach. His hands were slick with sweat, his arms trembling from exertion, but he refused to let go. One of his fellow recruits, a tall man with a fierce jawline, reached out and grabbed him by the arm, pulling him to safety with a strength that defied the fatigue in his own limbs. "Come on," the tall man grunted. "We don't leave anyone behind." The others, watching from their posts, were transfixed. The human soldiers seemed to fight not just their environment, but their own limitations. The concept of giving up, of stopping when the body demanded it, was entirely foreign to them. They fought for each other, not out of obligation, but out of a deep, inherent need to survive, to push forward no matter the odds. Dr. Vigric, the Karathi scientist, watched in awe. They're not just surviving the course, they're thriving on it. This is beyond what I imagined. These humans, they are a force of nature. The Tefaks observed in silence, their black eyes narrowing with interest. They are indeed something else. The assault course had become a blur of sweat, mud, and bruised bodies as the humans pushed forward, each obstacle more daunting than the last. From the first hurdle, which had seemed impossible, to the treacherous walls that now towered above them, the humans had moved as if possessed. The alien observers could hardly believe what they were seeing. These small, seemingly fragile creatures who, just hours before, had looked so unsure of themselves, had turned into a force of nature, grinding forward with unrelenting tenacity. Sergeant Major Adams was everywhere at once, shouting orders, barking encouragements, and pushing the humans beyond their limits. His eyes never wavered, never softened, as he watched his recruits struggle and fight. No time for whining. "Keep moving. You're not done until I say you're done." The words were harsh, but they had a purpose. They were designed to break the spirit of the weak, to burn away the illusion that any of these recruits could survive if they lacked the mental fortitude. Only the strong, those who refused to surrender, would succeed. As the aliens watched the humans continue to press forward, it was clear they weren't just enduring pain, they were embracing it. The human soldiers faced an obstacle that would have shattered the resolve of most other species, a pit filled with a slurry of sharp rocks and acidic sludge that burned through the outer layers of their clothing. It was meant to be a near impossible challenge, one that would force them to choose between quitting or enduring an excruciating, painful trial. The recruits hesitated for only a moment, then plunged forward, their bodies contorting in the most unnatural ways to avoid injury as they crawled through the pit. Dr. Vigric, the Karathi scientist, watched in disbelief. He had read the reports, heard the theories about human resilience, but seeing it in action was something else entirely. These creatures weren't merely fighting for survival, they were defying it. The Karathi had evolved to withstand the extreme heat of their home planet. But this was something different. The humans were, in some ways, rejecting their body's natural response to pain, to exhaustion, to overwhelming discomfort. They were denying the very survival instincts that every other species in the galaxy relied on. "They're insane," Vigric muttered under his breath, unable to comprehend how they continued. "They should not be able to do this. No species can endure such agony." Beside him, the Tefaks, normally so stoic, so calculating, seemed to be lost in thought. Their black eyes were fixed on the humans with an almost eerie intensity. It's not the body that drives them, it's their spirit. They're different from us. They don't bend. They don't break. They push forward. The alien delegation could only stare as the humans continued to battle the course. There was something primal about them, something raw, something unyielding that made them seem almost otherworldly. The sheer determination in their eyes was palpable. Even those who had fallen behind, who had failed to clear the last obstacle, simply dusted themselves off and started over, unwilling to accept defeat. One recruit, a tall man with dark hair and a tattoo peeking from beneath his sleeve, seemed to embody this spirit more than the others. As the recruits moved through the course, the man had fallen behind, his body clearly spent from the physical demands. His face was a mask of exhaustion. But it wasn't the exhaustion of someone who wanted to quit, it was the exhaustion of someone who had pushed their limits and was determined to keep going. As he reached the mud pit for a second time, he took a deep breath and jumped in without hesitation. His eyes were locked on the finish line. He struggled at first, his body too weak to make the jump with the same grace as before, but there was no quitting in him. His hands, bloodied and raw, scraped the mud beneath him, but he reached the other side, dragging his body through the sludge with a grimace of pain and determination. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. Adam stood at the edge of the course, watching with approval. "That's it, soldier. No quit. Keep moving." The recruits who had managed to make it through the course were panting, their faces pale with exhaustion, but none of them had given up. They staggered to their feet, their movements stiff, their muscles trembling, but they didn't falter. They were still standing, still alive, still willing to push through the unthinkable to finish the task. Meanwhile, the aliens who had watched countless races train, watched species from across the galaxy attempt similar trials, sat in stunned silence. The Tricasians, whose species was known for their ability to scale mountains and leap from tree to tree in the densest jungles of their homeworld, seemed almost uncomfortable in their seats. They had expected a display of brute force, of technical skill. What they were witnessing, however, was something far more unsettling. The Izol, with their mastery of biological adaptation, were equally speechless. "They are not just enduring," one of them whispered, almost to himself. "They're thriving in this environment. There's no logical explanation." The Tefaks simply nodded, their thin lips curving upward into what could only be described as a faint smile. Perhaps there is more to survival than sheer intellect, than biology, than the laws of nature. Perhaps there is something beyond all of that, something deeper. The human soldiers had already begun to circle back to the beginning, their eyes filled with an almost unholy fire as they prepared to tackle the obstacles once again. Their bodies were broken, their spirits bruised, but not a single one of them had given up. They had learned what it meant to survive, and they would show the galaxy that nothing would stop them. The humans had made it through the physical portion of the training, but that was only the beginning. As the sun began to dip beneath the horizon of the artificial training complex, casting long shadows across the ground, Sergeant Major Adams gathered the recruits in a circle. Their faces were streaked with mud, their eyes glassy from exhaustion, but there was a fire in them that refused to go out. They had survived the brutal assault course, and now came the next phase, the mental trials. "All right," Adams barked, his voice cutting through the fatigue that hung heavy in the air. "This is where the real test begins. Your bodies can take a beating, but your mind, that's where you'll either make it or break it. Now listen up." The alien delegates watched from the observation deck, their curiosity piqued. Until now, they had witnessed humans struggle through physical challenges with an almost supernatural determination. But this was something different. What could possibly push the humans beyond their already severe physical and mental limits? Adams explained the next exercise, a psychological endurance test that would immerse the recruits in their worst fears and most personal traumas, forcing them to confront their own demons in a simulated combat environment. The alien observers looked on in confusion, unsure of what to make of the human approach. Was this truly necessary? Were they so mentally fragile that they required such an ordeal? But they soon realized that the mental strength of the humans was just as formidable as their physical tenacity. Each recruit was assigned to a separate simulation pod, a translucent chamber designed to induce powerful hallucinations and create an environment where the mind would be forced to experience stressors far beyond what any individual could normally endure. The purpose of the exercise was to break the recruits, to make them relive their worst nightmares and traumas, to push them into a state where they were no longer thinking logically but reacting instinctively. The goal was simple: to see who could maintain control, to see who could fight through the fear, the pain, the disorientation. Inside the pods, the recruits were subjected to a barrage of sensations. For some, it was the smell of fire and smoke, the crackle of flames licking at their feet. For others, it was the feeling of suffocation, the crushing weight of an unseen enemy closing in from all sides. The recruits experienced their greatest fears in vivid detail. Some saw loved ones dying. Others relived the agony of losing a battle, of failing. One young woman, her face drawn with anguish, was forced to relive the moment when she had lost her entire squad in a disastrous engagement. The holograms of her fallen comrades screamed for help as they were torn apart in the simulation, but she could do nothing to save them. Onlookers from the alien delegation could only watch in stunned silence. They could not understand why the humans would willingly put themselves through such a torment. The Tricasians, with their reflexive agility and heightened senses, had always relied on their ability to react quickly to danger. The Izal, with their calm minds and ability to shift between phases of existence, could not fathom why anyone would willingly engage in such chaos. Yet, the humans did not crumble under the weight of these simulations. They fought. They fought against the terror, the grief, the despair, pushing themselves to endure, even when every fiber of their being screamed for them to surrender. Dr. Vigrik, the Karathi scientist, leaned forward, his segmented limbs twitching with uncertainty. They are confronting their worst fears. But why? Why put themselves through this agony? The Tefaks, as usual, were silent, watching with their dark, unblinking eyes. It is not the fear that defines them, but their response to it. One of them murmured. They are not overwhelmed. They are in control, even when everything is falling apart. Inside the simulation, the recruits were beginning to break free from their mental traps. The young woman who had been reliving the loss of her squad was now standing, her hand clenched into a fist. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she had stopped running. She had stopped retreating. Instead, she was moving forward, facing the phantom horrors of her past. She had no power to undo the tragedy, but she did have the power to endure it, and she would. On the observation deck, the alien delegates exchanged uneasy glances. The humans, who had only moments ago been struggling to scale walls and crawl through mud, were now exhibiting a form of strength that was entirely alien to them. This was not about physical power. It was about the refusal to break, to be destroyed. It was something raw and visceral, something almost primal. The humans' capacity for pain was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Adams watched the simulations unfold with a satisfied nod. He knew this was the moment that would define his recruits. You see, he called out to the humans, now emerging from their pods, their faces pale and sweaty. The mind is what separates the warriors from the casualties. You've learned something today. You've learned that it's not the body that fails, it's the mind. You keep that in check, and there's nothing you can't survive. The humans stood in stunned silence, their eyes haunted by the images they had just faced. But there was something else in their gaze, a sense of accomplishment, of having fought and overcome something that no one else had ever asked them to endure. They were alive. They were whole. And they would never break. The alien delegates, still grappling with the raw intensity of what they had just witnessed, understood one thing: the humans were not simply survivors. They were fighters, through and through. They had mastered the art of overcoming not just external challenges, but the darkest corners of their own minds. In that moment, the Deathworlders had proven something crucial. No matter how brutal the universe could be, they would always rise again. The following morning, the recruits stood at attention in front of Sergeant Major Adams, their faces pale and strained from the psychological ordeal they had endured. The physical tests had been grueling, the mental trials even worse. But now came the final phase, one that would test not just their bodies and minds, but their very spirit. It was a culmination of everything they had learned, everything they had fought for over the last few days. The recruits were about to face the ultimate challenge, the simulated combat mission. On the far side of the training field, a massive simulated battlefield had been set up, an environment designed to push the recruits to their absolute limits. The area was littered with mock weapons, makeshift barricades, and simulated civilians. Drones hovered overhead, recording their every move, while a fleet of specialized AI-driven units would simulate enemy combatants. It was a scenario designed to force the recruits to think on their feet, to move as a unit, and to do whatever was necessary to complete their objective. As Adams walked down the line, his gaze sweeping over the recruits, it was clear that their bodies had been pushed to the edge. Bruises and cuts dotted their skin, their muscles sore and exhausted from the unrelenting demands of the training. But their eyes were sharper now, more focused. The fear that had once clouded their expressions had been replaced by something else: determination. A fierce kind of resolve that only the most seasoned warriors could understand. "You've made it this far," Adams said, his voice steady. "But we're not done yet. You're going into that battlefield and you're going to fight. It's not about whether you win or lose, it's about how you fight. You fight until you can't anymore. You fight until your body's broken and your mind's shattered. And then, you fight some more. You don't quit. Understood?" "Sir, yes, sir," the recruits shouted in unison, their voices hoarse but unwavering. Adams nodded, seemingly satisfied. He motioned for them to move forward. One by one they stepped into the battlefield, their weapons in hand, their minds already beginning to shift into combat mode. The aliens, who had watched everything up until now, braced themselves for the next phase. They had seen humans endure unimaginable physical pain, had witnessed their mental strength in the face of terrifying hallucinations, but this would be the true test. The battle began almost immediately. A series of drones, outfitted with weapons and armor, swooped in from above, simulating an assault by enemy forces. The humans scattered, their training kicking in. They immediately took cover, using their surroundings to their advantage. There was no hesitation in their movements, no second guessing. Each soldier acted as if they had done this 1,000 times before. The humans moved like a single, synchronized unit, swift and brutal, with no wasted effort. Adams, watching from a nearby observation post, allowed himself a small, approving grin. His recruits were fighting as though they had already been to war. The young woman who had struggled through the psychological tests just hours before now moved with deadly precision. Her rifle was an extension of her arm, her eyes scanning for threats, her every step calculated and purposeful. Beside her, the tall recruit with the tattoo was engaging multiple drones at once, taking them down with expert shots while coordinating with his teammates to cover all angles. The aliens, still observing from the edges of the battlefield, were mesmerized by the human response. The recruits didn't just fight, they adapted. The battlefield wasn't just a test of physical strength or mental endurance, it was a test of how well they could make decisions under pressure, how they could work together as a team, and how quickly they could adapt to the ever-changing environment. And the humans passed each of these challenges with flying colors. Vigric, the Karathi scientist, couldn't help but mutter, "This is beyond any training I've ever witnessed. They don't think, they feel. They move as though they know what will happen next, as if they are always one step ahead of their enemies." The Tefax nodded, their sharp features narrowing with focus. It's instinct. Their decision-making is unpredictable, but it's also effective. They don't act out of logic, but they have something else. A drive to survive no matter the cost. The recruits continued to move through the battlefield, encountering ambushes, responding to simulated casualties, and completing their mission objectives. They didn't just react, they anticipated, they adapted, and most importantly, they supported one another. When one of them was pinned down by enemy fire, the others responded without a moment's hesitation. They flanked the enemy, covering each other's backs, never leaving anyone behind. The humanity of it, the willingness to sacrifice for their comrades, was something that the alien delegates couldn't fully comprehend. As the simulation came to an end, the recruits stood in the aftermath, exhausted and bloodied but victorious. The field was littered with deactivated drones, and the simulated enemy forces had been neutralized. Adams, who had watched the entire battle unfold, walked forward to meet them, his face a mask of approval. "You did it," he said, his voice gruff. "You fought, you survived, and you came out on top. You may not have won every battle, but you fought until the end. And that's what matters. That's what will make you soldiers. That's what makes you Deathworlders." The recruits stood tall, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. The aliens who had watched the whole event unfold could no longer deny the truth. These humans, small, fragile creatures by their standards, had faced challenges that would have shattered most other species, and they had come through it all. Not just as survivors, but as warriors. Vigric looked at the Tefax and spoke quietly, almost reverently. "Perhaps we have underestimated them. Perhaps. This is what makes them different." The Tefax nodded, their voice almost a whisper. "Perhaps. But now we know. The Deathworlders are more than just survivors. They are forces to be reckoned with." And in that moment, the alien delegates knew one thing for sure: the humans had proven they were not just creatures from a hostile world. They were the kind of beings who could not only endure chaos, they could command it.